Hey, what's up, y'all? My name is Michael Castañeda. I'm assistant professor over here at CCU East Bay. I'm happy to be in community with y'all today.
Yeah, I am Joy Salas. I'm assistant professor at Cal State LA. I'm also a member of Malaya Movement, the LA chapter, if people familiar. But yeah, welcome to our session on anti-imperialist diasporas. I'm gonna pull up our slideshow. Okay. All right. So hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm excited to be in this session or in this space with everyone, and I'm excited to be in this part of the, this summer school session with Mike Castañeda. I just want to start off by saying I invited Mike here because I really admire his work on looking at the Filipino labor movement from a transnational perspective and really like understanding Filipino workers as diasporic workers, which is part of this presentation or this session today. So in terms of our agenda, we have an intro, like a brief history of militant labor and anti-imperialism in the Philippines and the diaspora, and then the anti-martial law movement, the KDP, which was talked about in the last session, and also KMU, which is Kilusan Mayo Uno, which is a trade federation in the Philippines, and that's the biggest chunk of today's session. And then we'll leave 15 minutes for discussion, and then any concluding thoughts. So yeah, that's what we're doing today. Okay, so I'm gonna do the intro, and I hope people have noticed that this past summer has been a hot labor summer, and everybody's on strike. Hotel workers are on strike here in LA. Starbucks workers have been on strike all over the country. UPS workers almost went on strike, but I think they got a deal. And then for folks in LA and New York City, you've probably seen writers and actors on strike too. And I think this is really important to note because I think as a lot of these strikes have shown, and a lot of these workers have voiced, capitalism right now, and for a long time, maybe since it was first founded in the age of colonialism, capitalism will squeeze our time and energy out of us until we die, and people don't want that. People want to live, enjoy their life, and not just spend their time filling the pockets of the rich. So that's why people are on strike. And which many of us know going on strike is a last resort in terms of negotiations between unions and top management. And if anyone's familiar with the Filipino American community and our history, we know that going on strike and labor militancy is a crucial part of our community and its formation and our history. And we can't really talk about Filipino American history without talking about militant labor struggle, and also recognizing that a lot of Filipino workers, through their activism, through their unions, recognize that labor struggle and anti-imperialist struggle are linked. They're not separate from one another. So the point of today is to ask this question and to go through history with this question in mind. So how do we link labor rights and anti-imperialist struggle with the idea of mind, and with the framework in mind that Filipino workers are diasporic workers. They are right now, they have been in the past, and in many, for many decades, Filipino workers have labored for, actually still do, they labor for U.S. empire. And their economic oppression is global because our diaspora is global. I think, again, if anyone knows about the Filipino diaspora, we can be found in every single country, pretty much every single continent on this planet. And a lot of them are overseas Filipino workers who are in pretty precarious situations, like even here in like the United States. So like knowing that context, like, and with looking at the history of martial law, like what lessons does the anti-martial law movement teach us about linking grassroots workers organizing and like anti-imperialist struggle? And I think too, like when looking at like martial law, we think of the period of Ferdinand Marcos Sr., like 72 is when he declared it, and then it was like lifted on paper in like 81, but then his regime lasted until 86. But like martial law is a tool of like fascism, and it wasn't just Marcos Sr. that has used it. Like Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo used it, Duterte used it, and like martial law was first put into the Philippine Constitution in the 30s when it was still like a U.S. colony, and like the 20s and the 30s were like really like rich decades of labor organizing in like the Philippines and also in the US. So like thinking about martial law is not just like an event, but like a tool of fascism that has been used time and time again to like repress people's rights, particularly workers' rights. I think is like important to like kind of look at like the martial law era as not just like singular and isolated. So like so the session today, like the recommended reading was Mike's article on Jean Viernes and Silme Domingo's, the committee to seek justice for them after they were murdered by Marcos agents. And we actually kind of reference it here in this presentation, but I think this session is more like giving more historical and political context to the importance of like the work of Jean and Silme. And that's part of like a longer history of labor militancy in the diaspora. Okay, so like with this question in mind of like how do we link labor rights and anti-imperialist struggle, I'm gonna give like a brief history of like how militant labor and anti-imperialism have always been linked to one another. And these like early examples are from when the Philippines was, at least the first two, were when the Philippines was like a US colony. And just to like note that some of the first strikes against like US empire in the Philippines were also labor strikes, or there were strikes like started by Filipino workers. So like, for example, the first example, the Union Obrero Democrático de Filipinas. They launched the first labor strikes in 1902, and it was let me look at my notes. It was a total of 70,000 people who demanded independence from the United States. So like, that's what I mean when I say that like the militant labor movement amongst, Filipino workers has always been about, has also been about anti-imperialism. The Union Obrero Democrático de Filipina also had women workers as a part of it. And, kind of referencing like the callback to the last session, in this union, women did play supporting roles in it. And I'm getting this info from Judy Tagiwala's book on this period and how Filipino women were incorporated into like the capitalist economy during like the early American period. But she talks about how like women were incorporated through like the agricultural industry and manufacturing, and like they were part of the Union Obrero Democrático Filipina, but they weren't able to like ascend into any type of leadership roles because of what she calls like a feudal patriarchal view of what women could do as organizers. And a lot of the mindset at the time and the viewpoint at the time was that women should still first and foremost be like mothers and caretakers and wives. And then another example too is Amado Hernandez, who was actually a political prisoner, and he was also a labor organizer, and he was imprisoned because of like crackdowns in the government against like communist insurgency and stuff, which Mark will talk about in the next session with like looking at red tagging and its history. But like Amado Hernandez's case also inspired Filipino workers in, you know, the diaspora, like Carlos Bulosan, to start thinking about really how do we link the diasporic movement of workers here to what's going on in the Philippines, and understanding that like we can't just fight for labor rights here in the US, but actually like how is it linked to labor rights in the homeland? So Mike will talk more about like that history of like transnational labor solidarity. But I just wanted to give this, I guess, brief context to show like how these two ideas of like labor organizing and anti-imperialist organizing, how they are a really important part of like transnational Filipino organizing. And I think that's pretty much it for my part. Oh, actually, I wanted to say one more thing. I wanted to go back to the previous slide, right here, because this is a photo of a recent a demonstration outside of a Jollibee, I think in New York or New Jersey. But you know, I was thinking about this question because, like, you know, I've been seeing on the news like Jollibee workers are starting to organize because, again, like Jollibee Corporation is trying to squeeze its workers out of, you know, squeeze their time and squeeze their energy. And I think these workers in this picture were like fired as like a form of retaliation against trying to present some demands. And so it made me think of like what's going on now, like in terms of like Filipino workers organizing now, like thinking about, you know, how what they're doing right now, part of like a longer history of like labor organizing in the diaspora. So yeah, think about that the next time you get Jollibee. Okay, I think that's it for me. So Mike, please take it away.
All right, cool. Hey, what's up, y'all? So like Joy said, one, I want to say, like, I really appreciate the love on the article. It's cool if you didn't read it. If you want, like Joy said, I kind of see this presentation, I kind of approach it as organizing lessons from the movement, right? So we're going to kind of elevate some organizing lessons, particularly for folks who are actually kind of thinking about the question we pose, like how do we like scale up our organizing, right? In the context, it's not necessarily to say like, you know, in terms of, I think a lot of particularly with Sumi and Jean's case, they were, I think it's important to recognize they were rank and file workers, right? They started working in the canneries in the late 1960s, right? So, and one thing to kind of keep in mind, they were like, I think probably like 16 when they started working in the cannery, right? This is really personal history for me because my family worked in the canneries until at least like the 2010s, right? So, and if anyone, folks might have read like Carlos Bulason's The Heart, that might have been your introduction to cannery labor. But from really cannery labor in this context was the violence of capitalism was felt every day in the cannery floor, right? Just in terms of, it was a multi-million-dollar corporation that built its value on really the labor of Filipinx, you know, Asian migrant workers and Native Alaskan migrant workers, right? Or Native Alaskan workers, right? So, folks will be losing their fingers at as pushing fish through like a butcher machine. Folks would have to work, because of the nature of, production, people had to work like 18 to 20 hours straight, right? With like minimal kind of breaks here and there, right? Folks that I've interviewed would tell me about the dilapidated housing that they have to live in for like 3 months, right? Where you had, you know, large numbers of workers like crammed in this tiny space that um, wasn't even fit for housing, right? Literally, like, people would burn, you know, buildings would like light on fire and they couldn't get out because windows wouldn't be able to open, right? This was the type of violence that they experienced, right? So I think, kind of the lessons we want to elevate is like, how did, workers in that context that were organizing day to day, building relationships with workers, you know, scale up their activism to kind of develop like a like anti-imperialist critique, right? One thing I want to leave time for discussion, so I think I might kind of try to keep this to like no more than 15 minutes. I'm gonna try to push through. One thing I do want to say in terms of the article, um, I one thing I was trying to really kind of think about, um, that maybe just like in the chat, folks can kind of tell me, like, have y'all heard about the murders of actually the political assassinations of Sumi Domingo and Jean Pierre? Maybe tell me if you've heard about it, and also if you know about something called the Philippine Infiltration Program. Right. So, I mean, the teacher in me just like struggles with awkward silences, so I'm just gonna keep it moving. Um, but in terms of the Sumi Domingo were murdered in their union hall in June 1st of 1981. A month before that, they pushed their international union, the International Longshoremen and Warehousemen Union, to pass a resolution that didn't necessarily outwardly critique the martial law regime, but or the Ferdinand Marcos's regime, but they called for investigation. All right, and something that's really important about the ILWU is, they organized around kind of the commodity chain, right? They could actually shut down like the shipment of products, across ocean, right? So, but something to kind of keep in mind is the Philippine Infiltration Program is a U.S. Philippine program of surveillance that saw Marcos sending his surveillance officers to the U.S. since 1973. So since the formation of the KDP, right? And something I really tried to kind of think about is the title of the article was anti Marcos Filipinos, all right? And in terms of kind of thinking about, Sylvia and Jean were U.S. citizens, right? So their assassinations really rendered their citizenship mute, right? And in the context of as they really tried to push, justice and actually elevating it to like Ferdinand Marcos was responsible for this. It was a discourse of national security that always protected him, right? It wasn't until his regime was overthrown that he was actually charged for their murders, right? So, one of the things that I put in the chat is a document produced actually a couple months before their murders, right? And something to keep in mind, I really like, for me, I think one of the political lessons is actually thinking about the organizational structures that like these movements develop, right? So one, you have the KDP, which is like, Karen mentioned, was like a national organization that had ties to the Philippine left, right? But also for Sumi and Jean and the KDP were part of this Communist Party building organization that was national, um, called the Line of March, right? So the document that I shared, called A United Front Against War and Racism, Strategy for Resistance, you know. And, just kind of thinking about it, the way that Joy framed martial law, I think is so on point as a tool of fascism, right? So in terms of as like an organization, the Line of March brought together folks doing anti-Klan work because kind of the third iteration of the Ku Klux Klan was like emerging in the late 70s, right? You had folks that were doing all kinds of forms of anti-imperialist work, right? You had, if folks are familiar with the Soror Women's Alliance, you know, the organization kind of changes its name in the early 1980s, but they were part of this organization, right? And they were organizing, feminist politics around this concept of a united front against fascism, right? But they kind of changed the language to meet kind of the political context of the moment, right? So for them, the defining features, the driving forces of fascism as they understood it was war, in other words, US imperialism, and racism and white supremacy, right? So in terms of just kind of thinking about like in the article, something I really wanted to kind of think about was kind of the political collectives that KDP activists were a part of, how that shaped their organizing. And I think something that's really important to kind of think about is their relational analysis actually grew from real relationships on the ground. All right. Yeah. So I just want to kind of emphasize too, labor was like a key side of anti-martial law activity, right? It really intensified in the late 1970s just because Philippine labor unions became like I would say it was like a really leading site of fighting the anti-martial law movement in the Philippines, right? So I think there's a statistic, I think 135 um, strikes were occurred between 1976 and 1977, right? So in terms of, and one thing to keep in mind in the US context, US labor was kind of silent on it, right? The earliest kind of example of US labor taking any position was on the UFW, right? And for folks who might have read Philip Veracruz's biography, you know that this, it was, they took a really tragic position, right? In the context of, I believe it was September of 1977, Cesar Chavez was invited to the Philippines by Ferdinand Marcos. He was given an award for, what Marcos called his advocacy of Filipino American workers, right? He met like Marcos sponsored labor unions and gave pretty like glowing remarks on like their work in the Philippines, right? And then when he came back at the UFW convention, he brought Blas Oco, the labor secretary of Ferdinand Marcos, right? And I think this was a context where Philip Veracruz left the UFW. I think another thing that's really important too is Marcos not only sent like his labor representative, but he actually sent a medical mission to Agbayani Village. And Agbayani Village is a retirement home where mostly retired Filipino workers that were part of the UFW, right? So in terms of you have these kind of two contexts, right? One, Philippine labor is escalating like their struggle against the martial law regime, and US labor isn't taking a stand, right? So this is really kind of the political context in which the ILW becomes a critical site of struggle, right? So I could go to the next slide. So also something that I wanted to put out here too is thinking about going back to kind of lessons of the movement. Like, I think one of the things is like movement newspapers, all right? I think this is actually a really like powerful like organizing tool. One, the idea of like putting our ideas on paper, right? Passing it out to folks and talking to people about these ideas, right? So I have this quote from Bruce Osenya. Bruce Osenya was part of the national executive board of the KDP. But he also had a close relationship to county worker organizing in Seattle. So one of the things he said, we laugh about it now, but we'd be selling newspapers that support the armed struggle in the Philippines while we're trying to get signatures for a union reform effort, right? So in terms of actually kind of thinking about this, like, I think of, the newspapers, one, were a form of political education. Two, they were these types of like what we could call like ideological struggle at the union hall, right? In terms of, I think something to keep in mind with, Karen talked about like the KDP's dual line, right? They had kind of a policy of like domestic and international organizing could be separated, right? For context of, not everyone is, going to be on board with the anti-martial law struggle, but we could build like the concept around their concrete condition, right? But always kind of the question was, how do we bring the anti-imperialist struggle into these conversations, all right? So, when I interviewed KDP activists, they would always, like one of their favorite activities was passing out newspapers, right? And trying to have those conversations with folks, right? And just kind of thinking about, I pulled like a couple, newspapers that newspaper articles that were happening around like between 1977 and 1981, right? This time period where, the county workers are building kind of this like, reform movement in their union. There was a long history of union corruption, right? Largely brought on by the Cold War, pushed out a lot of like the union radicals, right? So as we're doing this, just kind of thinking about the nature of class struggle they're seeing in the Philippines, right? So one, you know, farmers being dispossessed from their land, you know, labor leaders being tortured and killed, right? But also organizations like the KMU, right? And the KMU, the Kilusang Mayo Uno, May 1st movement was a confederation of some like 500,000 workers by the early 1980s, right? And in that context, not only were they, militant in kind of their demands, right? But also they were calling out the development strategy of Ferdinand Marcos, which was tied to, driving down wages and enticing foreign corporations to come in to the Philippines, right? Um, so I think this is kind of one thing that we kind of elevate, right, in terms of building, having actual like tools of political education that could really nurture like a diasporic political consciousness, right, and building that into your organizing. So you can go to the next slide. So we already kind of talked about it a little bit. Again, I think just elevating, three lessons worth kind of thinking about. So one, thinking about history as an organizing tool. Joy talked a little bit about history of the movement in the Philippines, but also, really trying to look back at, their community elders' histories of resistance, right? History doesn't necessarily have to be a roadmap, but it's a tool, right? In terms of, thinking through like these political precedents, but also, you know, one thing that KDP activists would tell me is they saw, you know, political possibilities in the past, that can make a new future, right? Um, and then two, like as that's one part of political education, but also, really thinking about a political analysis of the present, like political condition, right? And then also thinking about movement infrastructures for transnational organizing, right? So I think, for the purpose of the time, we'll focus on the first two, um, and then open up for conversation, right? So, Joy, could go to the next slide. Okay, so I just want to elevate, one document that KDP activists really that were organizing in Seattle, um, that they always elevate is this 1952 ILW Local 37 yearbook, right? So the ILW Local 37 was the Filipinx-led cannery union. It has its roots. Went by kind of different names and had different affiliations, but dates back to 1933. Right? But in 1952, they found this yearbook that provided a model of that really actually actualized, this dual line of the KDP. All right. So one thing to keep in context, between 1949 and 1955, 5 leaders of the local 37 were facing deportation order to the Philippines for allegedly being what the U.S. state called alien subversive, right? So in the middle of fighting for their lives, they found they authored this yearbook that expressed a deep, deep solidarity with peasant and labor movements of the Philippines. So the article in the middle, "Terrorism Rise the Philippines," was written by Carlos Bulisan, right? A lot of folks know Carlos Bulisan by his writing and his poetry, but he was also the publicist for the union at the time, right? So he took the lead of kind of drafting this yearbook. Um, and so that one just kind of tapping into kind of like the really naming for their members, kind of like the type of repression that's happening in the Philippines, right? And then also kind of creating space, for movement leaders in the Philippines to at least kind of discursively share space with like their members, right? So Joy already talked about Amado V. Hernandez, right? And he wrote an article in the yearbook, right? And I'll just talk about one more thing and then open it up for conversation. Joy, could you go to the next slide? All right. So again, just kind of framing, not only was history part of their political education, but also they really took the time to study, the nature of, global capital and like U.S. imperialism, right? So this is a quote from Nemesio Domingo. He was one of the cannery workers who really he wasn't necessarily part of the KDP, but his family members were, and he was, on the ground part of like the organizing. So he says, I think politically, young people who made up the reform already had a sense of the early notion of what globalization really meant. And it wasn't by accident that the United States, in order to have cheap labor, looked to the Philippines. At that time, the idea of globalized economy, the issues of globalized capital had a different name. It wasn't called globalization at the time. It was called imperialism. What was common about Alaska, what was common in Hawaii, and what was common in the Philippines was that we're all working for U.S. corporations, right? And Joy, if you go to the next slide. I think we'll like end it on this. This is like a little blurry, right? But in terms of, this is a document that one of the organizers, Gene Viernes, put together, right? One thing, tying it back to kind of the organizational structures that the KDP had, a lot of this was developed in conversation with their comrades in Hawaii, right? And I'll explain that in a little bit. And essentially, Nemesio Domingo said like Filipinos were all working for U.S. corporations, but as they actually studied, their industry and how it related to the global political economy of migrant Filipino workers, they realized that it was one multinational corporation that was exploiting workers in Alaska that had ties to plantation work in Hawaii, that had ties to California agribusiness, that had ties to, and was also kind of setting up shop in Mindanao, setting up like banana plantation, right? And the martial law regime had a really kind of close connection to this, right? So in terms of, I think this is also a political lesson, right? In the context of, their like solidarity and the cerebral consciousness wasn't just rooted in kind of saying like laboring in Alaska and laboring in Mindanao is the same, right? But also actually kind of thinking about, when the same corporations are exploiting us, like how do we organize against it in our own context, and how do we show solidarity with others, right? Um, so I think there's more that we could definitely talk about, but I think we could open up for conversation, whether it's about also, could also, these are kind of some documents I just wanted to show that these are from like 1985, right? So the solidarity that Sylvia and Jean, even though they died, like the solidarity between the ILW the um, and the KMU existed well through the 80s. And this is just like a last kind of quote in terms of Cindy Domingo. She was a KDP organizer, led the Committee for Justice for Domingo and Viernes. And, when she was asked to kind of talk about, the lessons they learned from Sylvia and Jean's organizing, she said workers' rights for them was a broad political struggle that included the struggle for working people to work at their maximum potential without fear of repression or oppression. For those workers, be in Alaska, Seattle, the Caribbean, the Philippines, or Southern Africa, right? And I think this is something that speaks to kind of not necessarily the national collective they were part of, but the local collective, right? So they were also had a close relationship with a group of um, Black construction workers who were developing solidarity with workers in Mozambique, right? And I think another kind of model of coalitional organizing they did was actually creating these spaces where you know different movements could actually come together and share lessons, right? So this is the flyer on the left is talking about that, right, in the context. This is a year after you know the Ferdinand Marcos was charged with the political assassinations of Somi and Jean. So they had Ron Dellums representing the Congressional Black Caucus. They had a representative from leader from Mozambique. Cindy Domingo was talking about the work of getting justice for Somi and Jean. And they also had, organizer from the East Coast that was doing work, that was also doing kind of some transnational work around, supporting farm workers in New York, New Jersey, but also developing a political program of supporting workers in Puerto Rico as well. So I know we got like 10 minutes. We're happy to answer any questions, whether it be maybe about the article that I didn't talk about or about the presentation. I'm just looking at the comments too, in terms of Karen, like, I think you're right in the context of the thinking about the rise of Klan, one thing I will say, if you haven't already, please read No Fascist USA about the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee. Tell your white allies to read it, instead of reading about white fragility. But I think something to kind of think about is, and kind of going back to that context of not only in the article anti-Marcos Filipinos, but also, I talked about anti-imperialist diasporas is actually developing, like, folks were really actually trying to think about what does the particular political oppression that Filipinx workers were facing, what does that actually say? How does that speak to a broader trend of political repression that we're seeing, they were seeing in the 80s, right? So, I think one of the things is those conversations were possible because there were like these collectives that brought these movements together, right?
Actually, I have a question for everyone here.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're Filipino or not, I mean, and you have family that, came to the United States or like migrate out of the Philippines, like, did they migrate for work? Like, why did they migrate? If you want to share. Like, my mom's a nurse or was a nurse. She's retired now. My dad was a hotel worker and other service industry jobs. And then, yeah, Mike shared earlier, like, his family has been, has a history of being cannery workers. So, like, yeah, do people like personally relate? I guess that's my question. Like, considering your own like family's migration story or diasporic story. Yeah, and I asked that question too, because like when Mike said earlier about like seeing this history as like an organizing tool, like, have we talked about like with our like families or friends, like about their working conditions, like what they kind of like had to go through or are going through? Because like I think about like how the Philippine state like frames Filipino workers like historically as like, we're really hardworking, resilient, like even though like conditions are hard, we're still happy, like we still enjoy what we're doing, like stuff like that, which is obviously very like neoliberal. But like what do like if you actually talk to folks, like what do they actually like feel about it? So yeah, just something to think about.
Not any other folks have questions? Let me see.
Can I just jump in too?
Yeah.
I think
For sure.
one thing I wanted to, one really important takeaway, I think, is sort of that global perspective that you
Yeah.
have both provided, that thinking about labor is not just something, or like migration, like going to the US as just people searching for better wages, right? But actually seeing it as a kind of situated in the fact that the Philippines is impoverished by these multinational corporations, right?
Yeah.
Now, And it's not just impoverished because they're trying to find it's, they're trying to keep wages low in, outside of the US, uh, although that's a part of it. But also because they can benefit from a kind of fascist dictator, right? Who will work with corporations over the needs of people, right? And so when you see all those things intertwining in both your work, especially in this event of political assassination, right, of labor leaders, it really brings home just how significant um, this kind of framework is in really rethinking the immigrant story. Instead of thinking about people as just economically searching for better um, situations, the fact that they're being displaced because of how messed up it is under the kind of either Marcos and his regime, but also the kind of popular vigilante violence, right? And it's not something that just went away, obviously. And I think that's something that you're all kind of alluding to, but what's something that keeps on going because of the way the needs of particular multinational corporations to keep certain areas destabilized in order to just move production anywhere they want to, right? As long as they can get sort of the help of those in power.
Yeah, and I think one thing I try to think about is like they really tried to understand the political moment they lived in, right? So in terms, I think there are kind of lessons to take, like in terms of organizing strategies to take, and even kind of thinking about, at least something I tried to kind of think about in the article, right? One, you have folks like Somi and Jean who are like Filipinx American, right? But were still assassinated by like the Philippines, right? But then you had folks who were who left the Philippines, were kind of like exiles of like the martial law regime, or were immigrants, and were politicized when they came to the U.S. They were also targeted by this new extradition treaty that the U.S. and the Philippines kind of negotiated in this, after, pretty much like almost immediately after the murders took place, right? So in terms of, I think for me, kind of the lesson is not necessarily to say that like repression is exactly the same, but also like to elevate their like method of political study, method of organizing, method of, organizing with others, uh, to make sense of the political repression of the moment, right? I don't know, Joy, if you wanted to say anything else in relationship to what Alan was talking about, or some of the things coming up in the chat.
I mean, I wanted to first thank everyone for sharing like their like family stories in the chat. Because I think, I don't know, when I teach this like stuff, I, try to encourage people to think about their own story in relation to this broader history, to see that they're not like separate from it, or like the history is not just something that happened in the past and like it's over, but actually like it's part of like why we are here, and like why we want to learn about why things are the way they are. And so like I think like going back to Mike talking about like the yearbook, the 1952 ILWU yearbook, like I think like this workers organizing and like seeing it as necessarily transnational, that wasn't something that like was automatic. Like it had to be like really practiced and like really cultivated through like relationship building. And so like this type of like transnational like consciousness is like something that's not a given. Like it's something that you have to really like work at and like make happen, like to actually have like
you know, justice for workers and like across the globe. Like it is something that is like painstaking work. And so like, yeah, so that's just something I wanted to add.
Yeah, in relation to that too, like I know when Karen was talking about the KDP, like really referencing it was like mostly young people, but I think it's also important to recognize that you know, a lot of these like old left like monos who were like part of the Communist Party, you know, in the 1930s were doing a lot of, you know, organizing from the 1930s, 1950s. Like a lot of them became like maybe unofficial members of the KDP, and some cases became members of the KDP, right? And I think there is, you know, part of this history too is, you know, that intergenerational learning that happened, and really recovering these histories of resistance that were stolen from, like literally the divide. They had an analysis. The divide was a product of political repression, right? And you know, and domestically, you know, thinking about the context of the Cold War, you know, so in terms, I think that's another kind of, you know, again, kind of thinking about one of the lessons like intergenerational, like creating those intergenerational spaces uh, is also something that really like rejuvenated these movements.